Good morning, and welcome to this live BrightTALK panel coming to you from Black Hat. Today's conversation this morning is going to be about IoT in the enterprise. And, it's interesting timing for us because we've been talking about this for a while. We've had some internal discussions. And just within the last week, Microsoft has released a report that makes a claim that nation-state actors have infiltrated 1,400 different organizations across every sector. And they did this using only 3 IoT devices, which are the most common ones, is VoIP phones, they used IP cameras, and actually video recorders. That's one that's kind of new to me. So we were having this discussion about, today we want to talk about what is the actual threat, how do we assess threats in enterprises, and what are some recommendations around that? Like, how do we solve for this, and what are the different things? And in light of the Microsoft report, it makes it very real from us, and it makes an excellent starting point. And to have this conversation with me today, I have 3 industry experts, Jason, Todd, and Rudy, and I'd like them to take a moment and introduce yourself.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I'm Jason Soroko, CTO of IoT at Sectigo.
Todd Weber, I'm the CTO of Optiv Security.
I'll break the CTO trend here. I'm Rudolph Araujo. I'm the VP of Marketing at Awake Security.
Great. So this Microsoft thing, it's interesting because the 4 of us, we were having a discussion a week ago and we were talking about what are all these threats. Well, now we're living in a threat and they're issuing a note to 1,400 companies. And Jason, I want to start this off with you because I know with Sectigo, you guys think about identity. It turns out that a lot of these devices were compromised from either a default password or they just logged in. It wasn't very magical. Like, what's your thoughts around that?
Exactly right. We're talking about, again, such an old theme of weak forms of authentication, right? So in other words, forms of authentication that have been around 20, 30 years plus username and password, which as we know in the enterprise IT world, really should be deprecated. They'll be with us for a long time. Should never have carried over to devices, especially headless devices like you just mentioned. Stronger forms of authentication exist, and especially for headless devices that don't have a username and password that they're going to be typing in. In addition as well, part of the report that I've been reading is about firmware changes. So in other words, not just the integrity of the identity of the device needs to be protected, but also the integrity of the actual firmware that's running on the device as well. But yeah, it's a perfect timing for that attack to come up for this talk.
And Todd, at Optiv, you guys, you touch everyone. It's like, how regular is this? Is this a regular problem you guys are seeing?
It's a ubiquitous problem. I can't think of a company or enterprise out there, and for that matter, a residential household that doesn't have this kind of issue. And the ubiquitous of the problem will actually probably try to help us solve it. And that everybody has this issue. Everybody has to look into these issues, and everybody has to at least assess where they are in this, and look at their attack surface of where these attacks could come from. Most of them are trying to do, using it as a relay vector. What can I do? I can't do much with a camera, but what can I get to from that camera?
Yeah, you know what? That's actually a really important point too. That the idea here wasn't to compromise the device; it's the intrusion. Which Rudy, you guys, I know you spend a lot of time looking at incident response. Where are they going? What are they trying to do here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the interesting story here, right? I think a lot of the IoT security focus has been on securing the device itself and securing industrial IoT and things like that. And not that those things aren't important, but this is a great example, and this is primarily what we've seen, right? Where, to Todd's point, these devices get used as a very easy piggyback into the rest of the organization. Because frankly, they're not on the radar of a lot of security teams, right? Because security teams, you tend to focus on kind of the known attack surface. You're not thinking about the Polycom phone that's in the conference room. You're not thinking about the security camera. And unfortunately, I mean, maybe this is the wake-up call we all needed, right? I think the other thing that is reading that report that occurred to me, it probably wouldn't have taken a very sophisticated, in this case it was supposedly a nation state, but given the dynamics of this particular threat, I don't think it takes a very sophisticated threat actor, and that's maybe the scariest part about it. Right?
Admin isn't really.
Yeah, exactly.
So.
Yeah, I suppose you can get the answer in a Google search, right? So you bring up an interesting point about most security teams do not even consider IoT devices. So where do those persist in the network? How are they handling that? I'll leave that open to.
Well, they definitely not seem to be taking a lot of the advice that's come out of everywhere, which is network segmentation. Such flat networks. If we're talking about IoT in the enterprise, enterprises already have fairly flat networks, which is a problem, as we know. You start adding IoT to that, the ability to pivot, as you say, from those devices into other things, it's pretty easy. So therefore, operational technologies, IoT devices, the ability to actually segment that, those technologies are around, they're just not being used.
Well, segmentation is certainly a valid way for people to address, or not just through segmentation, but also implementing things like zero trust functions with authentication mechanisms, and that defines their access privileges. But also, just being able to understand what is your attack surface. And as Rudy was mentioning, when is IT security involved in like buying thermostats?
Yeah, right.
They're not, and many times security doesn't know that they're there. They don't get any input into where they go or how they get access to the network, and those are the kinds of things that need to change, as well as backing into the supply chain of what kinds of things are we buying. How do we tell the procurement people that devices that are by and large very cheap devices in many cases, but how do they get at least some rudimentary form of security validation at a manufacturer level as before they get onto our networks?
So that brings up an interesting point about assessment and who's to blame. Like, so you're right. So it's a purchasing thing. Like, first of all, who is bringing in devices, and how are they deciding that these are acceptable devices? And then who's telling security later? Like where does that blame fall? Like how do you do that?
I don't know if there's blame to put around. I mean, people they need thermostats, they need building, HVAC systems, and these things have been known to be more efficient, or either through operation or through support mechanisms if they're connected to a network and if they're connected to the internet. I'm not even sure. I haven't really read an RFP coming out of a real estate service thing, but my guess is, there's usually requirements that it has some level of optimization and some level of remote telemetry functions, but just the aspect of security rarely ever gets into that mindset because it's not a traditional IT asset.
Right.
It's not a traditional thing that you would apply those.
Sorry, I was going to say,
Go ahead.
I think part of the challenge is we don't even think about these as traditional computing devices, right? Which they very much are. I mean, like, even if you think about something like a Raspberry Pi that's plugged under a desk, this doesn't even have to be a thermostat necessarily, right? But these are all computing devices, which by definition mean they have access to the network. They're accessible. To Jason's point from earlier, they're probably on the same segments. I mean, we've seen cases where we had a couple of exercycles that were internet connected, sitting on the same segment as a bunch of SCADA devices, right? And again, I think blame may be less, and it might be more of an awareness thing that something like this, the report, will hopefully help shed light, right? And then security starts getting more involved, both from a procurement perspective, but also from a process perspective, right? Do we know how to handle an incident that starts off with a thermostat or a Raspberry Pi device? Because I think a lot of the skills and the tooling are still kind of getting developed.
Which I would say most organizations would have no idea how to go do a forensic analysis.
But no, there is I think where it might go, if you guys might agree, is things like Underwriters Laboratory. You're not going to buy a light bulb without a UL on the side. Right. There could be equivalents to that down the road. But also, I think we are starting to see things such as the consortiums, Open Connectivity Foundation, right? If that standard's written on the side of the tin, right, a procurement officer can say, hey, that at least has some level of security and it's measurable. Right. So I think that's where it could start.
And I think that's a necessary function. I don't know if necessarily legislation has to occur to do it, but if legislation is a jump point to get to there, then that's probably what needs to happen. But us as security practitioners, I mean, we have to go teach procurement officers how to go look at these things, because there is really no reference. I mean, there's several reference architectures out there, but none of which are universally adapted or universally known. And also it differs by country as well. And so far we're only talking about the easy stuff. We haven't even talked about the biomed and the industrial control side, where it's like where life, is a proximate problem.
Right. I mean, Todd, the point you made earlier is also interesting, right? The buyer here is not your traditional IT buyer, right? And the margins on these devices are so small that if you go into a procurement person and say, hey, that thermostat that was going to cost you $16 is now going to cost you $35 because we've had to add a bunch of security capabilities into it, it suddenly changes the dynamics of the market entirely, right? So it's not an easy problem that is going to get solved overnight, but I think awareness is the first step.
And the good news is there are solutions, with authentication mechanisms that companies like you are doing, but also on the front end, on the manufacturer side, there are companies like Vdoo that do actually a front end kind of analysis on these firmwares, and where they look for particular things like default admin passwords. They'll look for particular backdoors in the firmware, like was it built in to do some VPN? As long as you put in this key, then you automatically it happens. They actually showed me like 4 or 5 of them, and
surprises.
it doesn't. And I mean, and and just doing that base level function, and to the integrity of the firmware itself, to put a hash value onto that, to where you can, at least apply some level of before you actually buy. Now, the education process is we have to go, educate our procurement people of like, this is important to use as a standard, because obviously Vdoo is not free, and why would manufacturers buy them? And then you have the other side, from the corporate side. There are security controls, and there are security partners like Armis and you guys and several others, ORDR, many others that look at different components of IoT, and they may look at different values. But I mean, looking at what we've talked about, trying to develop that attack surface. What is it? What is there? What is it vulnerable to? And how do we go remediate it?
So you bring up an interesting point, though. So, and this kind of falls a bit into the consumer space as well, that IoT devices are an assembly of parts from different manufacturers that get put together into a manufacturing process. And that could be anything from industrial devices to consumer devices. That you have firmwares. You mentioned something about firmwares earlier. It sounds noble and good to say the manufacturer is going to start building more secure devices, but how do we ensure that happens beyond just the ratings? Like, how is it that when you buy a Samsung TV, that every component in it was out of date on top of the TV software itself? And how do you ensure that whole supply chain? Like, how do we address that?
I think one of the ways that I'm seeing it within customers right now is there seems to start being at the OEM level an awareness that sometimes earlier in the supply chain, from the chipsets that are actually being employed are actually not as constrained as they thought. And as time goes on, not necessarily with brownfield, but with greenfield devices that we're seeing built, more and more things are coming out with secure elements and things that can actually have a unique identity with an asymmetric certificate that actually can hold identity within that device. Now, unfortunately, there's probably all kinds of devices sitting out in the world right now that actually have those technologies within. They're just not being taken advantage of, right? So therefore, for the extremely constrained tiny sensors, or as you said, in the consumer space where that extra 1 cent for a certificate might be too much, that's a different story. But at the controller level, right, for the verticals you were talking about, automotive, medical, et cetera, industrial control, those devices that are being built right now, actually from the earlier part in the supply chain, do have those capabilities. It's not even about adding in cost, it's about knowing that it's there and taking advantage of it.
I mean, I think the other thing that maybe gives me a little bit of hope, right, is if you go back 15 or 20 years and think about the state of web application security, right? Big popular websites had cross-site scripting and SQL injection and things like that.
Still do.
But it's gotten better, right?
Oh no, it's all gone away, right?
But I mean, the point I was going to make is like OWASP, as an organization kind of came together and really kind of helped, I think, elevate. And again, look, it's not perfect. It's not to say that every website doesn't have these vulnerabilities, but it's going to take some level of community effort to kind of define these standards. Ensure that suppliers, ensure that procurement folks, everyone involved in that puzzle kind of understands what it takes to build one of these devices, right? And hopefully we'll get there sooner than 15 or 20 years. But I think something around that should help as well.
The awareness factor, as we've mentioned, is the first step, which I think we're getting towards a full awareness of. Well, I say full aware, at least a partial awareness of the main problem. Is that there are so many devices that, and like we mentioned before, there's no company that doesn't have this problem. I mean, so we'll just have to, what applies value. I mean, it's very interesting. You talk about that they've actually in many cases taken the wafer space to actually put on security control features, because that's usually the main question of like, how much wafer space can I take to add security features, which for the most part, from 15 years ago had no value. But now we have to apply a value to that, and how much are customers willing to pay additional for that valuation?
So into these questions, I don't think we're going to get through this panel without asking this question. This comes from the audience. Where does blockchain fit into IoT? And how much does it cost per device?
Let's go there.
Let's go there, guys.
The one thing as we were talking about the supply chain for these devices, right? I mean, I'll say upfront, I'm not a blockchain expert, right? But I know that blockchain does have a lot of applications when it comes to ensuring the integrity of the supply chain. And when you talk about firmware and things like that, I think that might be an opportunity to leverage these things, because again, these are not monolithic devices, right? I mean, like you look at the thermostat, there's probably hundreds of components in there, so that's because if you think about it, if I'm a nation state or if I'm looking to compromise an organization, trying to find rootkit kernel malware is probably not worth my time anymore when I can come in through the TVs that you have in every conference room, or the polycoms, or the thermostats, right? So I think that's potentially an application of blockchain, but
I would say that I would agree with you on the immutable ledger kind of
Right.
function, that it's, it can't be changed, and to understand, okay, this was, configured in this way, and this is the valid image, and then moving along as a back end like encryption technology, or as a back end authentication mechanism. I got to tell you right now, I think there are better ways to accomplish that. I mean, I'm very interested in your, but I mean, we've seen lots of companies that come out to, I think, just to say the word blockchain somewhere in their features.
Pretty sure you get another 5 or 10% from investors by saying.
As long as ML and AI is
That's
in there
correct.
too.
That's right. Now, I think blockchain has some killer apps. It's not as much as people might think.
Right.
I think you have to ask the question first: is a central database just better than a blockchain? If the answer to that is yes, then just go with your regular database that's protected. Blockchain is ideal for distributed situations. So, in other words, think of medical, where medical records that are data that's being spit out by devices needs to be seen by multiple public third parties, and the absolute need for that to be distributed and not centralized is important. Maybe blockchain has a place there, maybe, but I think in most cases a traditional database of some kind could probably suffice.
Yeah, I mean, Jason, you make a good point, which is, it's not just the security of the device, but it's also what that device then produces or impacts, right? So, like medical devices, hopefully have a higher standard of security, I would hope, than
They don't.
No, we should aspire.
Chris said it for us. I don't have to say it.
We should aspire for, right? So that's another aspect of this threat landscape that I think is worth maybe talking about and thinking about, right? Because it's not just that device, but it's like what kind of data does that device have access to?
Well, and you bring up another interesting complication is that, with biomed devices, normally, IT security people aren't allowed to touch those devices. By regulatory between.
They're not even allowed to patch those devices.
Right.
Exactly. I mean, those have
Or
to go
change
back.
the setting.
They have to be to the manufacturer and and I mean, there's very valid reasons for what they're doing. But the same occurs in, industrial control. The same is true for we're here in Las Vegas, so the IP slots side of the gaming networks. Strangely, they don't let hackers on that part of the network. I don't know why. But those have to be done by certified gaming technicians who don't necessarily have the IT security background to understand what they're maybe exposing these assets to.
So you guys are actually bringing it. I think the next place we need to go here, going back to the Microsoft thing. So they just told 1,400 companies that they're potentially compromised by their IoT. We're getting into some practical assessment here. So what would you recommend these companies do? Okay, somebody's told them you might have a problem. What now?
Well, as you were mentioning before, it's like this is not a greenfield environment.
That's right.
This is and this is just the stuff they know about.
Yeah.
They'll have to put in so first of all, just the base stuff. You have to understand what is out there, and that's where you first have to do it. And then assess once you get comfortable that I've captured maybe not all, but at least 90-some% of then, okay, what do we do with these? Are they running vulnerable to at least known vulnerable functions? O-Day is going to be a different story and always will be. But and then kind of go into the are we doing authentication? We're doing the basic things that are already innate or into these product sets that just aren't happen to be turned on. And then the the incident response side of this. I mean, I rarely see companies that are qualified, and I mean I don't mean this in any sort of negative way. It's just nobody teaches how to go through a camera and there it is right there. There's the bad piece of malware code, but people are going to have to start learning those things as they mature down into their security programs, which I would say is going to be a shift for most of them as they mature. Most of them are looking to mature in different ways, and they're going to have to retrofit IoT into their plans.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other part of this is not an IoT exclusive problem, right? I think what the Microsoft report also showed is this is a blended threat landscape problem or threat surface, attack surface problem, right? Where these IoT devices fit, kind of nicely, so to speak, within the rest of the IT environment. So I think trying to figure out, okay, if you see kind of lateral movement, what does lateral movement look like when it's an IoT device hitting, because maybe the traditional ways of we've thought about lateral movement or credential abuse or things like that don't really fit, right? So is there a role for like the MITRE attack framework here to maybe evolve to think about, a new set of threats? Legislation has come up a couple of times. As you guys know, NIST just put out some guidelines, actually this week, I think. And the good news is it's open for comments till September. So this is again like a call to action, I think, for all of us in the community to try and influence that, right? I mean, because I think ultimately that's what's going to help companies that don't have the Uber level of security maturity to say, okay, what's at least the top 5 things I need to do to protect my organization.
Mention the NIST guidance, which of course is not prescriptive, but it at least has some good stuff in there. One of the things it's calling for is automated configuration management. So in other words, Microsoft or others, somebody who's the vendor of that device might be able to give a cheat sheet on how to reconfigure that device, even without physically changing it, because it's brownfield, as you say. But maybe there's a configuration to take admin and change it to something else, maybe.
So what about the companies that are already compromised? Rudy, you kind of went down a good thread there that if somebody's compromised their IoT devices already, they need to start looking bigger, right? You got to start seeing what else it's been talking to.
Right.
And I think almost for the most part, most people have to assume that they've been compromised at some level. It could be minor levels, but they'll have to apply different models. Meaning like nobody really knows or at least not many people know how for your company, Chris, in Vectra, like how many controllers does a normal camera speak to? Should it only communicate with one and then one patch update server? And
that's a good question.
To look at those kind of like what are supposed to be the traffic flows. The good news is these are very static in IoT environments. So being able to find anomalies should be actually
connected to Twitter.
Yeah, Twitter. But that's where people are going to have to start applying. At least that's beyond that attack surface validation and then the vulnerability. And I love the configuration management because patch management isn't always the solution. Segmentation isn't always the solution. And configuration management is a huge one as well.
If you read down far enough in NIST, it's calling for exactly what you just said, which is if the device can't log, you're perhaps in a lot of trouble, especially from a retroactive standpoint.
You have no evidence.
Exactly. So therefore, one of the things NIST is calling for is make sure that device can do some form of logging, so that if it is connecting off to Twitter or doing something that isn't standard, at least you have some idea.
Yeah, you got to put a syslog client on things now.
Yeah.
I think the other maybe positive here is this. We'll throw in another buzzword here, right? But what this is also coming at the same time is the kind of the cloud prevalence, right?
Well, I mean, to that point, cloud and IoT are almost synonymous at this point because you had a bunch of devices speaking to the cloud.
Right, and I think that's where the likes of Microsoft probably have a role to play, right? I mean, Microsoft, for instance, offers an IoT backend, and obviously they are likely to have far more of a sophisticated security program than the average maker of the IoT device. So, can we build more security into the platform, so to speak, right? So that's another, like, especially when it comes to things like logging, there's going to be a limited amount of logging you can do on the actual device, right? Just form factor, cost, et cetera. But I think as these platforms start to evolve, I think there's going to be more onus on the platform, kind of the back end side of this, to build in a lot of these security capabilities as well. It's not going to fix every problem in terms of segmentation and things like that. There's, that's not to say the onus is completely off the company that's deploying these, but that might help.
I also see an opportunity for newer companies to come out and do central management of IoT functions. And how to plug into what's available from a configuration management or vulnerability management, and whether or not they follow the MUD standard or what's the IETF one for update? It's called like standard update. There are standards for these kinds of things, but then how you centrally manage those functions, because we're talking in some cases tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of devices in each enterprise. And, okay, you get it to where you want, but there are 100,000, and then tomorrow there's 100,001. And so how do you apply, an operational component after you actually get some controls in place?
Well, it's the art of authorization, right? Yeah.
So how does that work, though, when you guys mentioned earlier that a lot of these devices can't even be touched by the company and they're owned by the vendors? In healthcare, I know that's a big thing. Like there's a manufacturer, the device gets purchased by a doctor or somebody like that. They're put in. There's an IT security team in the hospital, but the manufacturer owns the cloud and the device and the updates.
But I mean, there are other ways to, mitigate that. I mean, you can't touch the device, but you can mitigate what the device is speaking to. Now, granted, where human life is at stake, you want to be pretty careful about what
Sure.
you're doing there. But, and just the awareness that, A, that device is there, B, this is what that device does, and it's configured in this way, and it's communicating to these other components. And just understanding that, I think, is a step forward for many of us.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Todd, something you said earlier, right? Like, again, the good news is these devices tend to have very static, behavioral patterns, right? And, I was kind of half joking about the Twitter, right? But, if they do start communicating to a place that they've never communicated before, or they don't communicate relative to their peer group, right? Because all of the polycoms or all of the thermostats should have, again, very, very similar behavioral pattern. And so I think there's opportunities to apply data science and techniques like that to kind of identify these malicious or potentially compromised devices, especially when they start hitting your IT resources, right? Because again, no reason maybe that one of your IoT devices should be logging into your SQL server, right?
Or even trying to establish communication.
Right, exactly.
And those will be great things to do, but I mean, establish those baseline criteria. And there are several companies out there that will help you do this.
Yeah.
So that becomes interesting that you say that. So companies help you do it because the one thing that I know people also struggle with is talent. Let's call it the time and talent problem. Like we got people that are overworked, overloaded. There's all these nice ideas we always have in security that never get done because no one's paying attention to them doing it. So how do we scale that, especially at the scale that IoT is going to be?
Well, that's what I was just mentioning is eventually after you establish that baseline function, you will have to fit this into your normal security operations, which, the regular things apply to a talent shortage. So you're going to have to do things like, automation. How does automation fit in? How does central management fit in? Because that's the only way you're ever going to get any sort of nominal control over the environment is to have those levels of components and that input into security operations.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, like think of, people think patch management is a problem today, right? Imagine if you've got 1 million devices to patch, because there's some new vulnerability that got just announced. I think, there's going to be some level of paradigm shift here, right? I mean, maybe we move into a model where it's a much more of a kind of a, how quickly can you detect and respond to something because maybe you can't prevent everything every single time. And I think, again, I think the onus is, on us as a community of security professionals to kind of help define that standard and drive that forward because some of the stuff will just translate as is, but like, things like incident response, like you were saying earlier, Todd, I mean, it's not going to be the same, like can you pull logs off a device? Not going to be the same thing, so.
Can I look at the registry? No.
Right,
No.
exactly.
Within the supply chain, from the chipset manufacturers down to the OEMs, in other words, just before the consumer, even those companies really need to partner up with security companies.
Yeah.
Those people have 10 engineers and 100 problems, and therefore solving the toughest security problems is maybe not something they really should be doing by themselves. The thing is, though, I think by the time it gets to the consumer, by the time it becomes a report like we just read, it's a head scratcher where almost all of a sudden incident response becomes really, really important. But goodness, I think in the greenfield part of it, more needs to be done. Putting out devices with admin is that's got to stop.
Yeah, and I mean, I bring that up because to that point in the report, when it says 1,400 companies were hit, you now have a trend and a pattern and a consistency of people ignoring devices, like universally. That's not like a one-off.
And plus, we just gave a recipe book too. So
Yeah, basically.
Like, okay, let's I wasn't looking at it today, but I am tomorrow about like who's got admin out there.
Yeah. The thing is, though, within that supply chain, for example, even if you were to go up to a level of authentication that is prescribed by something like NIST or one of the consortiums, the thing is, you still have issues to deal with, right? So in other words, the cryptographic algorithm that the certificate might be using might be fine today, but in 10 years, if this is a device, this might last 10, 15, 20 years, which is where post-quantum, starts to edge in. Again, I think
which is on the horizon line.
It's something we absolutely have to be watching. It's not going to bite us tomorrow, but it is going to bite us.
But I think just baby steps is like at least take DES out of the mix.
Right.
Because that's probably resident on on the native components. That's probably all that's there is like a very limited form of encryption. But to your point is like when things like OpenSSL, and so I remember when OpenSSL had a vulnerability and everybody was like, I don't even know where all my OpenSSL versions are. But those are the types of things, as you put into SecOps from a CMDB stuff component as well as a landscape, threat landscape component, is to understand where all those are and how, you can get to the how as well, but just understanding where they are and that how many of you have of them is a good step. But to your point about cryptographic, from a manufacturing standpoint, I don't necessarily know how to tell the manufacturers to put, quantum computing into, their little minor chipsets that, cost like 4 cents. Yet, I don't. That's a difficult one. I'd rather just take one little baby step first.
Talking of baby steps, right? California passed legislation that requires the passwords to be changeable and not be default. I think I completely agree with you, right? I think there's things that we can do that kind of help move the ball forward. I also think one of the, I was talking to one of our customers and he said, look, one of the challenges we have is you can buy these devices. Let's say you buy 50 of them. They could be like 6 different variants just within that one box, right? Even though they're all functionally doing the same thing, because again, the supply chain for these things is so complex, right? And so as he's thinking about patching and he's thinking about how to kind of manage this from a configuration perspective, it's not just one device. It's a plethora of devices, and then you multiply that by all of the different other types of devices in the organization. So yeah, it's a complex problem, right? Luckily, they have the 4 of us to figure it out.
But what's not in that California legislation, which I find interesting, is there's no prescription for encryption of the wire. So in other words, even if you did put in some form of authentication more than just that username and password, you put in a symmetric token, for example. A symmetric token is going to be passed in the clear. Therefore, what have you done? Therefore, the NIST guidance and even the federal legislation that's been proposed does have that, but some baby steps might be too small of a step, and I think California legislation is an example of that.
That's something to be aware of. I haven't read the California legislation. That's interesting stuff.
It's fairly new, and they're trying to adopt a lot of things from GDPR and things like that in California, as it tends to do. So all the other states will be looking at it. That's a really interesting point, though, that you don't think it's going to be enough. So what is enough? Where's it got to go?
What's the minimum viable security? I think where NIST is going, and even where the federal legislation, which I think before we talking today, you were saying, the federal legislation says do what NIST says, right? I think NIST is getting close to being the minimum baby step.
So do you think NIST is like, this becomes a broader topic now? NIST has been a framework and a guideline for a lot of companies. There is a segment that has to adhere to it, which is ITAR regulations, DFAR, government contractors. They have to completely adhere to it. Do you start to see that model moving into other manufacturers, like in order to do business?
I would say just if they have to do that for the federal government, they're not going to set up a separate production schedule for here's what we're selling to the federal government and here's what we're selling to everybody else. They're going to apply the same construct across their entire production line, and that's what the federal government, I believe, is hoping for. Is that they'll be able to drive, a further standard just by saying if the federal government buys it, then it has to follow these standards.
That's right.
Yeah, I think look, that's exactly the point, right? The big buyers are going to be the people that influence it. The DoD is a big buyer, right? And just like if you look at standards for cars or things like that, safety standards, et cetera, they're all influenced by where not by the mom and pop shop that's buying the individual things, but hopefully that helps, because I don't know if legislation will necessarily pass, right? I mean, we all know kind of the logjam that's in DC today, but I think the NIST guidelines are hopeful to me because just the buying power of the government and eventually the large
I think
hospital
just the
systems.
attention to get to
Yeah,
it has
totally.
been helpful to push people in a direction, even though the legislation may not pass or it may take a long time for it to pass. Just the awareness of that NIST has a responsibility here, and NIST is actually trying to write that responsibility.
And frankly, Microsoft using its visibility to basically say this is a real problem. I think again like part of this is just awareness, right? I mean, and that'll help I think also drive behaviors.
One last word on it. I think federal does affect absolutely everything because they run hospitals, they run fleets of cars. There's smart city, right? In Washington D.C. itself, there's not a single IoT vertical that they don't procure into. They will affect everything.
Yeah.
And my hope, just as a personal consumer of everything, is that enterprises may be able to fix this, but what am I doing in my house?
Right.
So the further we can push this along, the better I feel as an individual. Because we all have the same problem in our homes.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh yeah.
At least we've moved away from the era of having routers that you'd buy at the store and they'd be admin, right? So they've kind of moved that along. So hopefully we can get some of the other consumer devices moving along as well.
So I mean, we
I gotta
talked.
go check my Raspberry Pi. I don't know if I turned it off.
So
Maybe
we
this
talk
one?
about that. Obviously, that primarily it is bad username and passwords. But as you say that, a lot of the Linksys routers were compromised. This is when we start getting into vulnerabilities. Like I think the password gets used because it was so obvious and easy.
Yeah.
We know attackers don't like to use advanced attacks unless they have to. Like
They'll go to simple every time.
right, 0 days are a waste of time if you can just log in.
Right.
So once we get past the username and password, we start to think of other type of IoT hardware vulnerabilities, stuff like that. What do we start to look at?
Well, there's other vectors that we're not even really talking about yet.
Yeah.
If you think some of the things is Wi-Fi is not the only air that networks use. We have Bluetooth, we have NFC. I mean, you have lots of other wireless technologies that are out there that most enterprises won't have scanners or any ability to even sense those networks exist. I mean, you think of what could possibly, like I can go stand outside a window, stand up a Bluetooth component and like see who attaches.
Universal plug and play protocol have vulnerabilities. The most recent Tesla ECU attack I saw, there was an open FTP port. Lots of ways in.
FTP in your car?
That's right. That's right.
I'm sure that'll get covered in the hacking villages at DEFCON this week.
Yes,
Let's give it to Valasek and Charlie. I'm sure they'll do it again.
absolutely.
I'm sure they're already working on it. So let's kind of pivot this into the prescriptive vendor space. Let's call it that. So these attacks have happened. There's companies compromised. There's all these things that we'd like to see come down the pipeline, like better legislation. Let's all contribute to the guidelines of NIST, trying to make recommendations on how these devices should be built. Let's start thinking about how we start to control these. But what can we, as the security community, provide companies like now, today, immediately? Or what are some things that we can start doing for them?
I think a couple of things that come to mind, right? One is that discovery, visibility problem. I think being able to just know what you have and then be able to classify it, right? It's not just knowing that this is an IP address, but knowing that this is this model of a Honeywell thermostat or
Running this version of firmware or that is possibly vulnerable to these 4 or 5 things.
Right.
And maybe even inputting threat intelligence, which are all available today. You take that threat intel to say, hey, there's a known, not just is it vulnerable, there's a known exploit to this function that is going around that hopefully Microsoft shares, and then we can use it to those extents. Those are all easily. I say easily. They're available today.
It's possible. It's achievable.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and then the other side of this is you got to assume that these are either compromised or likely to get compromised. So then, what's the plan post that, right? Again, I think most organizations you walk into don't necessarily, think about incident response even in general, right? I mean, every big breach you hear about, and you feel like people are running around after the fact thinking, like, how do we deal with this, right? Now you throw in IoT into the mix, all bets are off.
I'll be honest and say that's one of my genuine worst fears is if you make that assumption that at some level they've been compromised, having to make a recommendation of throw all this away and go buy a brand net new and then apply your controls from there is that's a very daunting thing to be able to do. But in many cases, if you can't do this attribution level of is it how to an incident response of how do we look for components, and not just the traffic side, because it could be just staying dormant, waiting to awake at a certain time, but just not that understanding of what could be compromised. But I mean, IoT devices have been out there now for a lot longer than the security controls have been trying to control.
Well, what happens when it's a $1 million robot in a manufacturing plant they've had for 10 years and somebody just plugged in?
It's interesting you mentioned that. It's I talked to a client who had printing presses that were manufactured like in the early 1900s, and they've made one change to them since the early 1900s, which was changing it from physical typeset to digital typeset, and that's it. And that was like in 1970 something. And I mean, how do you go tell that guy? Yeah, it might break it. But I mean, and his point to me was like, there are no spare parts for this thing. There are no, there's no way to fix this. I mean, he even told me that the printing presses were too big to actually move in the building, so they built the building around the printing presses.
Wow.
So I mean, it's very hard to have that discussion with him about, yeah, you need to put in some security controls, but it's very scary for many of these people who, their job is to keep those printing presses, or whatever the business process is, their job is to keep those things up and running.
I got to say though, one of the bright lights where we've seen some security being actually put in or being thought about very hard is at the consortium level. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is because there is commercial needs to either interoperate securely, right? So this is why people come together in a consortium, or it's my brand reputation is so on the stake, or in the oil and gas industry, the risks are so great that I do have to get together with my competitors and figure this out. And so whenever we've seen that, regardless of the vertical, some really good thinking has actually been done. So therefore, yes, that is for greenfield. It's not for, as you're talking about, the devices that are already put in. But for the devices of tomorrow, I think the consortiums right now are leading the way. And in some verticals where they just can't get rid of the risk, they have to do it right. That's where we're seeing the real bright lights right now.
And those are the people who are going to have the knowledge of being able to mix like the technology side with the business component of what they're trying to do. They're going to be in the best position to do that, rather than me as a user.
I will say, as of, just this week, we've talked to a few, medical device makers, for instance, and they actually view this as a business opportunity as well, right? Because it's a way
to differentiate.
Yeah, as a way to go to their clients and the hospital systems and the VA and places like that and say, like, look, we're better than this other company because we've built security into the platform. Here's all of the options that you have, once you go with us, whereas with this other vendor, you don't get that. So I think, again, there's definitely an opportunity here. Again, for the stuff that's already deployed, harder problem to solve. But for the stuff that's still getting deployed, or the newer stuff, I think there's definitely.
To your point, though, don't let that get in the way of moving
Exactly.
forward. You still have a problem,
Right.
but still move forward.
Yeah.
We'll have to come up with a different solution to fix what's already there.
Imagine a day when security isn't just considered a cost center.
Yeah.
As you're saying.
We've been saying that for ever.
It's been a long time.
Yeah, that's a long one. So I think we're coming to the top of an hour here. So as we're running out of time, I think as a takeaway from each of you, I want to hear like, what is your one key takeaway around IoT, and what are your thoughts? Like what do you want to leave the audience with? And let's start with you.
Sure. Back to the basics, and especially in terms of anybody building devices today, really think hard about modern forms of authentication for devices that are headless. Right? There are correct ways of doing this. There probably is something within your supply chain that will allow you to enable that for not a lot of extra cost, which is probably front of mind for people in that industry. For people who are purchasing within an enterprise, I think it came up here today. Procurement language. It might not be as simple today to be able to say, well, here's the check boxes that I need to check. Those check boxes are coming. But in the meantime, procurement language for enterprises for IoT security is probably pretty important. I think that's it.
Todd?
I echo a lot of that. I mean, the first thing is that there are solutions to many of these problems, and you don't have to solve them all today. Just take a leap forward to do the basics. I mean, and that's really all we owe our companies and our enterprises we have to do our due diligence of care what's within our control or what should be within our control, and fix those things that we can. And then the second part is the education side to procurement and to the other business teams that have a stake in this, whether or not it's real estate or the biomed components or the plant managers. And I mean, the plant managers have a little bit more going because they've had to deal with it for a while longer. But for the others, like especially real estate, I mean, hasn't been part of their normal everyday. Like, oh, are we doing this securely? And those are the two takeaways I'm taking.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, coming at it from an enterprise IT perspective, it comes down to something that we've touched on multiple times, right, which is knowing what you have and characterizing it, right? So there's the old saying in security, right? If you don't even know it exists, you're not securing it. So I think to me that's just one of the big challenges that I think we've got to help customers and organizations solve. And then the other thing is, again, my bias to the response side of this, right? Like how are you going to plan for when the inevitable happens? When you do get that call from Microsoft, what do you do, right? Mm-hmm. If you're a healthcare organization, does that mean you shut down the hospital for the next 3 days while you try and patch these devices? Probably not, right? So I think having that and kind of doing your tabletop exercises, et cetera, to figure out what you would do if you were in a situation like that is probably another part of the takeaway.
That's a good one too.
Yeah, and so with that, I think this has been a great conversation, gentlemen. I really appreciate it. Just to add mine to it, to me the takeaway here is that do something now. There are 1,400 companies at Microsoft labeled as one nation state that potentially compromised. I guarantee every company on the planet has a problem, especially with things like Shodan scanners and ways that people are looking for devices regularly. Like I've admittedly done it myself. Like you can just see what's out there. That today, at a minimum, everybody needs to go out there, look what they have, and just check the basics on it, as we said. And the problem's real, but it's achievable. I think that's what we're hearing as well. It's just going to take some work.
Yeah, absolutely.
So with that, thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate your time, gentlemen.
Thank you
as well.
Thank you.